Rufus from Annunciation Greek Orthodox Church, which is an official co-sponsor of this wonderful event, and here is Father Tito.
Good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank everybody for being here. It really is a blessed opportunity that we have today to learn about Eastern Orthodox Christian spirituality through the lens of an academic, a sociologist from the University of Maine, that being the husband of Emily, who previously spoke, Dr. Kyriakos Markidis, who I first came across back in, I think it was 2005, when I was at the seminary. Maybe 2006. He was giving a lecture and was presenting the book at the time that he had written, The Mountain of Silence, which is the book that we read for book club last year in the fall of 2021. We're now just having finished up the sequel to that book, Gifts of the Desert. And when he'd come to Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology, where I was a student at, I was a freshman or a sophomore at the time, I walked into the discussion that he was giving, and it was just absolutely fascinating because he was talking about the paranormal within the Christian tradition that I grew up in. And the only person that had ever spoken about Christian mysticism or anything that was paranormal related was my grandmother back when I was a child. So when I began to hear an academic speaking on the subject, I absolutely became really intrigued and felt like the greater Western world especially needed to hear about this, because it's really rare that we hear about cases that are related to paranormal psychology within the context of religion, specifically Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Less than 1% of America is actually Orthodox Christian, and yet we're the second largest denomination on the planet. So, without further ado, I'd like to ask Dr. Kyriakos Markidis to come forward so he can offer his lecture today. And just like to remind everybody how huge of an inspiration he has been to me, and I truly believe to so many people around the world who have been learning about Eastern Orthodox Christian spirituality and Athonite spirituality. So thank you. Without further ado, I'll pass on the mic to you.
Thank you, Father Theodore. And thank you all for coming here today. It is a great privilege and honor to bring us all the way from Maine to this other part of the world of America. I think it was such a pleasure meeting. I've met Father Tess many times before, but I had the pleasure of meeting at the airport Professor Paul Barnes, which and we really became instant friends. Yesterday I was at his presentation in the classroom, and he made me feel that I was in heaven with the kind of music he produced at that time. And then he started chanting a Greek Orthodox chant, and he made me feel that I was at Simonopetra on Mount Athos. So you are very lucky to have him around here. And so I thank the Greek Orthodox Church of Nebraska and the University of Nebraska here, the Department of Classics and Religion. And I hope that my presentation will be as logical as my wife just mentioned. So I hope I will not disappoint you, because sometimes being too logical is pretty boring. So I have a lot of stories to tell you, and hopefully to share some provocative ideas within the context of modern academia. I looked at the title of the program here about encountering God on this earth, and I would like to share with you how I encounter God on this earth in my personal life, and what kind of conclusions I have arrived at in my life about our relationship to something that is beyond the physical material universe. So I can start with a few propositions or axioms or assumptions or theories. that I would like to share with you. Number one, that it is easier today to be, for a thinking person, for a rational, logical person, a scientific person, to believe in in the spiritual foundation of the world. Okay? In other words, the dominant perspective that we have inherited from the 18th century, that the only world there is the physical universe, is no longer tenable. And I'll explain why. Second proposition is that the world is becoming more and more religious and spiritual, and that contradicts the secularization thesis that is so dominant again in academic circles. Number three, I would say that modern science is really pointing the way away from materialism. That the dominant perspective that I encountered in my own education during the 60s is really based on assumptions and foundations that belonged in the 19th century. So it is time today to really think outside the box and lead towards a different consensus about how the universe works. And as a French philosopher once said, I think it was, I forgot his name, he said that the 20th century either will have to become spiritual or it will not be. And we academics have a special responsibility to make sure that the world will continue in the foreseeable future. Another argument, another proposition that I would like to share with you is that mysticism or mystical understanding of reality may offer us a more complete and meaningful understanding of the nature of reality. That's something which within our world we consider it as totally bizarre and outside of reason. It may be the very fact that we need to recover if we are to survive in the long run. Are you following me?
Yes.
These are things that I would like to share with you. I was thinking the other day that the secular worldview that we have inherited. Incidentally, once I go over this material, I will like to tell you how I have discovered mystical Christianity during the several decades of my academic life. What is a secular worldview? Let me give you a very brief summary, and then I'll go into my own personal experiences that led me to the opposite of what this secular worldview tells us. Number one, that only matter exists. In other words, only the physical universe that is accessible with our five senses. Right? Number two, only knowledge, the only legitimate knowledge is scientific knowledge based on the five senses. There is no knowledge outside of what is accessible to our five senses, aided by the scientific instruments. Okay. Number three, this is part of the syndrome of secularism. Values are absolutely relative. They are socially constructed, and what people consider as values are nothing more than personal or subjective opinion. So there are no values that are embedded in the very nature of reality, because they are not scientific, right? So truth, as one contemporary politician said, truth is not truth. So he was uttering this postmodernist kind of ideology that has come to dominate our higher cultural life. Number four, humans are products of genes and cultural conditioning. No soul, no spirit. In other words, human beings are no different than animals, right? So study psychology, for example, and what you get there is really biology, is really animal behavior. So if we are to reduce human beings to the animal level, then we open the possibility of treating other human beings like animals. Just as an example, we can say that an airplane is like a car, right? And of course, like a car, it can run on a tarmac, right? But an airplane is not just a car. It can also fly, and no car can fly. Similarly, we as human beings have an animal body, but we are not just animals. We are like the airplane who can transcend the physical law of gravity, right? So when you define the universe like that, there is no meaning in life and the cosmos. The cosmos is absurd. The cosmos is a brute fact. Let's get over it and try to live as best we can, right? Death is the end of human life. No life beyond. So if you define that this is the only reality there is, if you define that human beings are nothing more than blood and bones, then of course there is no reality beyond the grave. This is the dominant understanding of how we as human beings are. And the conclusion is, as uttered by a great philosopher of the 19th century, God is dead. Humans are the measure of all things. I read for the second time the other day the book by Michael Harrington, who came up with the title of a book, The Politics at God's Funeral. In other words, he took it for granted that we have reached a state in our human development where God is irrelevant because there is not such a thing as God. So there are no miracles, because miracles are nothing more than collective illusions. No angels, no demons, no principalities, nothing of that sort that mystics are talking about in all the great religions. And religion eventually will wither away as rationality advances. So logical people like myself are not supposed to believe in anything that implies religiosity. So religion is the root of all evil for some contemporary philosophers and scientists, particularly after 9/11, right? You hear letters like, books like God is not great, God is dead, the passing of an illusion, all of these things. So all of this is what I would put together as the secular manifesto. And all of these arguments, all of these things that I just mentioned are really false, as far as I am concerned. They are half-truths. But on a deeper level, perhaps it is the way spirit works in history. That we had to go through that in order to elevate our consciousness to a higher level. So in other words, this challenge that comes from this perspective is forcing our consciousness to think at a different level. So I welcome, for example, the criticism that comes from the books of Dawkins about the God illusion, as he points it out, because as a reaction against his atheistic manifesto, so many wonderful books have come out that elaborate completely the opposite. Okay? So what I would suggest, what I would recommend that for us to reflect is that science today, really, as I pointed out before, is pointing the way to religion. A great atheist like Anthony Flew, an English philosopher, spent his entire life attacking the idea of God. because it was considered to be a leftover of an irrational past. And 2 years before he died, he published a book. Guess with what kind of title? There is a God. And the subtitle is How a Notorious Atheist Have Come to the Conclusion that God is a Reality. Now, why do I mention him? Because he was part of this neo-atheist kind of resurgence that appeared after 9/11, and it's almost like an organized religion to fight religion. And when this came out, it was quite a scandal, because all his followers and all his people who believed in the atheistic manifesto fell from the sky, so to speak, with shock. So, and what Flew claimed was that what brought him back, what brought him to religion was modern science. He didn't tell us why this is the case, and what I will try to do today is to point out what are some of the things that are leading us to the recognition that spirit is everywhere and transcendent and yet embedded in the very nature of reality. Okay, now why did I come to these conclusions? Let me tell you a few things about my personal life, because my conclusions is part of my personal experience. I am a trained sociologist. I've spent 10 years during the 60s studying social science. I came here because I had relatives in Ohio. I didn't have any money to come to the United States and study, but thanks to an uncle of mine who decided to leave Cyprus in the 1920s, he brought his brothers and sister here, and then they brought me so that I can study as an undergraduate at Youngstown, Ohio. That's where they were living. One was a steel worker, and the others had grocery shops. So I came here to study business administration. I signed up for a business school. My aim was to become an accountant, get a degree and go back to Cyprus, because that was my Ithaca. That's where I want to build my life. And when I applied to work at the local library at the university to make some extra money, I had to be in an interview with the librarian who had a doctoral degree in philosophy from some Ivy League school, I believe Yale. So when he asked me, what are you studying? I told him where I came from, and I said to him, I'm studying to become an accountant and minor in economics. And he said, oh my son, you came all the way from Cyprus to study accounting? What a waste. I was shocked. I became red in the face with anger, because how dare you tell me this? And I said to him, but look, I love philosophy and I love liberal arts, but what am I going to do with such a degree in Cyprus? I want to go back home and make a living. You cannot make a living as a philosopher, right? He didn't respond, he just signed the paper, gave me the job, and more or less, he dismissed me. So, sometimes I wonder, did this guy play any role in my later change? Because by the time that I finished my junior year, I said to myself, oh my God, I am in the wrong field. And I became desperate. Am I going to spend the rest of my life counting numbers? Nothing wrong with being an accountant, just that I felt that I needed answers to my existential questions, and accounting had no answers to that. Coming to America from a traditional society, I felt very severely challenged. My worldview was collapsing. I encountered this syndrome of modernity. Of course, I didn't analyze it like this, but I thought that somehow all my faith that I carried with me from Cyprus were questioned now. And I was thirsty for knowledge. I was thirsty for some answers to my existential questions. And accidentally, all of these accidents that happened in my life, if you look at your lives, if you tonight spend 5 minutes and think over all the extraordinary coincidences that brought you where you are at this point, you will see that it will make you think whether they were coincidences. How little things, little details can change your life to the other side of the universe, right? So I accidentally met a student and we were having a conversation and I said, what are you studying? He said, sociology. What is that? And he started explaining to me and I got excited. So I went to the chair of the sociology department and I said, Mrs. Botti, she was a very wonderful human being. I took a course from her as my first year. I am discovering that I'm in the wrong field. What do I do? I would like to go into sociology. Well, he said, why don't you apply to graduate schools and see what happens? I said, but I don't have any background in sociology. Do that anyway, and I'll write a letter for you. So I went home, I started writing letters. I filled something like 10 universities. All of them accepted me, but without any financial assistance. And I couldn't continue. So I went back to Mrs. Botti. I said to her what happened. I carried with me the application forms of Bowling Green State in Ohio. And I said, I know what the answers would be because they cannot offer me financial advice because I don't have a sociology background. I have a background in accounting. And I said to her, I'm going back to Cyprus, come what may. And then I said, I have these forms from Bowling Green State, but I'm not going to fill them because I know what the answer will be. And she got angry at me. She said, go home and fill those forms. You are missing your chances. I meekly said, I'll do it because you asked me to, but I know what the answer will be. A month later, I got a call from the University of Bowling Green offering me full assistantship and free tuition. So that's how I started my academic career in sociology. And then, to make a long story short, I had many of these encounters throughout my life, both resulting in positive experiences and negative experiences. And when I put everything together, I would not change a single detail from all the things that brought me to this point. Because any simple change, any simple detail would have sent me into the opposite side of the universe. So we live in a mystery, and we are a participant in creating our reality, so to speak, right? I can share a couple of more of these coincidences to see how powerful they are. When I was in Cyprus, after I got my doctoral degree, and I went there for a leave of absence without pay, just to spend some time in Cyprus and write a book that I already started. I was getting ready to go back to the States, to come back to the States. And then a friend of mine asked me, why don't you give us a talk at the Cyprus literary organization? I said, I don't have time, I'm getting back to the States. So after a lot of pressure, I said, okay, I'll give you a short talk about the history of sociology. So I went to the Kypriaga Chronica, or Cyprus Literary Organization, and I started talking about the history of sociology. And then right in the audience, guess who was sitting? She's sitting right here. So I couldn't focus. Then when I finished, when we finished the question and answers, I was hoping that I would get a chance to have a chat with her. And then I noticed that she stood up and she was getting ready to come towards the podium, but others came around me and started asking me questions. And then I saw her turning back and leaving the room. And I said, oh my God, I felt so disappointed. 5 minutes later, she comes back. She went to start her car, and then she had a question she wanted to ask me, a very challenging question. She felt cold actually that night. And instead of continuing, she turned off the engine and came back to ask me the question. And this question changed our life. I asked her, your question requires a lot of conversation. So why don't you join us for a cup of coffee? We are going next door here, and with a group of friends, and why don't we converse there? Well, we've been carrying that conversation for the last 50 years. So you see, these little changes in, had she decided to start her car, I wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't be I probably would have gone somewhere else. I would not have studied these mystics that I studied. My life would have been entirely a different life. It happened to me also when I decided eventually to go back to Cyprus after I met Emily. And I went to say goodbye to a friend of mine because in Chicago. And I said to him, he was a former professor of mine, we became friends. And he said to me, by the way, you know who is chair of the Sociology department at Northwestern University? He gave me the name, I had met him before, and I gave him a call. He invited me to his house, we had a conversation. I had dinner with him and his wife during the evening, and he said, what are your plans? I said, I'm going back to Cyprus. I wanted to go back to Emily, and I wasn't planning on coming back to the States. Because I couldn't imagine that she would come back to Youngstown, Ohio. So anyway, he said, what did you find a job in America in a good university? I said, well, I'm not looking for a job, but if a job comes around, maybe for a couple of years I can try to get the experience. And I left him an article that I had written. So in a month's time, I got a phone call from the University of Maine if I would be interested in being interviewed for a position there. So had I called my friend in Chicago to say goodbye to him and not going there, I would not have met that professor who was decisive in me staying in America. All of our lives is a series of an infinite number of synchronicities. And if we look at it and we make a point of examining every single coincidence, number one, we are awed by the extraordinary power of these coincidences. And number two, you wonder whether in fact they were accidents or they had a deeper meaning. Arthur Koestler wrote a book, The Roots of Coincidence, and he spent during a large part of his life to take notice of all the coincidences in his life, and he concluded that they could not have been coincidences, and he wrote a book about it. So I felt the same way in reference to my life, our life, in the sense that at every single moment, every decision we make transforms our future radically, which means that we are co-creators of our own reality, right? All right, now during the 60s, and I divide my life in terms of decades, during the 60s was the period of my secularization. The acceptance of these principles that I pointed out, I reluctantly came to the conclusion that the only universe is the physical universe, that there is no life after death. All of that is nothing more than make-believe. It It was the result of lack of education, part of our superstitious past, and of course, all the things that I was exposed to in my academic life, the kind of books that my professors were assigning to me, were books that confirmed those assumptions. If you study philosophy, you study Nietzsche, right? So what did Nietzsche say? God is dead. We have killed him. In other words, our historical development reached the point where God is dead. He was a bit depressed about it, but nevertheless, his message was carried over into the 20th century. The philosophers that take over the academic departments, Sartre in literature, an existentialist atheist. Freud who claimed that religion is a form of regression to infantile stages. Marx pointed out that religion is the opiate of the people. It is being used throughout the ages for ruling classes to keep the lower classes oppressed. There is the story of Voltaire, who told his guest not to speak that there is no God, because if our servants find out that there is no God, they will cut our throats. He said it in tongue in cheek, but that is the world that I was exposed to, which led me to give up accounting and economics and go into sociology to open my way to the spiritual later on. So everything is interdependent. Nothing is accidental, at least in my own personal experience. So by the time I got my doctoral degree in 1970, I was a reluctant agnostic. I felt that the ultimate questions, the questions of life, cannot be answered. Therefore, it's a waste of time. Remember that film, Zorba the Greek? Remember when the widow died? They killed her. And then Zorba asked the British friend of his, who was an intellectual and a writer and so on, he said, "Boss, why do men die?" He said, "I don't know." And he said, "You don't know? And what are all these books that you are reading are telling you?" They tell me that about the agony of man who cannot answer questions like yours. And then Zorba replies, "I spit on that agony." Remember that scene? That was pretty interesting. So that's how I felt, that the books that I was reading were not answering those existential questions. So I gave up. I said, these are not answerable questions, and I incorporated those assumptions that I pointed out at the beginning. Well, we got married in 1972. We went to Maine with the notion that we'll stay there for a couple of years and then go back to Cyprus. And certain other events, negative events, like the invasion of Cyprus by Turkey, the takeover of the northern part of the island, in a way forced us eventually to settle in Maine. So we consider ourselves as privileged refugees, because Maine is not an unlucky place for one to live in. So one day I walked by let's see, I don't want to take all the time. I have to keep track of time. We can speak for many hours. Yes. All right. I will lead to how I discovered Mount Athos, right? And what it means for me right now. A friend of mine who came to the university the same year as I did, Stephen Marks, we were assistant professors and we became friends very quickly. One day in the fall of 1972, I saw outside of his door a note saying, "Please do not disturb, meditation in process." And then I said, "What on earth is this?" never heard of meditation. I thought it was some kind of fruit from the East that I didn't have any interest in. So anyway, to make a long story short, before you know it, we started meditating. Steve showed us or explained to me, to us, that meditation is good for you. It makes you much more alert. It's healthy. He gave me all kinds of empirical data showing, in fact, that meditation is good for you, and that also it will help you get tenure because you can work harder. Anyway, so we did that TM, Transcendental Meditation, for 7 years. It opened the way to a different reality for me. That was during the 70s. And I started reading, Stephen Marks started giving me all kinds of books about shamans, like the teachings of Don Juan. And I've read the first 4 books, I devoured them. I've read Fritjof Capra's The Tao of Physics. I started reading about Hinduism and Buddhism. And I became fascinated. I said, oh my God, maybe there is something over and beyond the material universe. So I was beginning to be skeptical of my skepticism. That somehow my conclusion that life's most important questions are unanswerable is false. And that there is light at the end of the tunnel. So those things were percolating in my mind, and at the same time I was doing my academic work like everybody else. And my specialization, which was in political sociology, led me to study the problem of terrorism. So I was having my first sabbatical. We went to Cyprus, and I was planning to write a book on international terrorism. That was at the time when very few scholars were really dealing with that problem. That was just before Ayatollah Khomeini came to power in Iran. And then accidentally, as I carried my material to work on the terrorism project, I met a former friend of mine, a friend of mine that I knew from before. We grew up in the same city. I hadn't seen her for about 10-20 years. And she invited us to her home. We met her husband, who was a judge. She was a high school principal. And we started philosophizing. And I was very impressed with their knowledge. And I said, who taught you all these things? He said, well, we have a teacher. And who is your teacher? Daskalos. Daskalos was a Christian medicine man that lived 2 miles away from my house. I never met because we were told when we were kids to stay away from him because he was dangerous. Why was he dangerous? Because he was contacting the spirits. He said, well, I'd like to meet him. So here, after 18 years in America, I decided to go and meet a man who lived only 2 miles away from my house. It took me all my secularization experience in American university to dismiss any fear of meeting somebody like him and get to know what on earth he's doing. We met him. I was very impressed with his intelligence. He never left Cyprus to study abroad. He only had a high school education. But I was impressed with his extraordinary philosophical mind. I mean, like meeting a Socrates of sorts. So I decided to study him. I don't want to go into the details how I ended up being accepted as a participant observer in his circles. But I discovered that he belongs to some kind of a a group of followers who were coming to listen to his talks in the Stoa, a little place like a catacomb, so to speak. So I spent 10 years studying that man. That was during the 80s. So if the 70s was the time when I was questioning my scientism and my agnosticism, the 80s was the empirical validation for me that there are realities beyond the physical level. How did I come to this conclusion? Well, I have been a witness to extraordinary physical phenomena that I could not explain logically or rationally. I can give you a couple of them. One time, after I published the first book, The Magus of Strogoros, a fellow from New York wrote to me or called me up in my office if I would take a picture of his wife who had problems with her health, but there was no diagnosis on the part of the doctors about what the problem was. So I said, I'll be happy to take the picture because I'm going there this summer, and I'll give it to him. So when I did go, he closed his eyes, he wrapped the picture, and he said, the problem of this woman is in her teeth. They're all infected. She should take them all out and put dentures. I said, what are you talking about? How can I write to these people what you're telling me? I thought it was nonsense. So I said, do as I tell you. So I wrote to them, and I forgot about it. I came back to the States, and I get a call from this fellow. He said, do you remember when I sent you my wife's letter? Yeah, I remember the case. I wrote you a letter. Well, he said, we thought it was nonsense and we threw it away. I said, well, I don't blame you. Well, just wait a minute, he said. After we did that, my wife's front teeth exploded and infectious pus was dripping from the hole. So we went to the dentist and we found out that indeed all her dentures, her teeth were full of infection. Took them out, put dentures, and she became healthy. How on earth, what is the probability that this was just a coincidence, right? And one of my mentors, Professor Leonard Duke, the late Leonard Duke at Yale University, he was a psychologist, and he became some kind of a, do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How come? I can talk loudly, but
No, you turn it off.
Can you say, oh, you turn it off? Oh, maybe. Hello? Hello?
Nope.
Hello?
Nope.
Oh, you want one of the other mics?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's get one of these.
Probably battery.
It's better.
I'm glad it's not me because I know that I am.
Hello?
I am not a very.
Let's try that.
Okay, very good. Yeah, Leonard, I said I was helping him out in some piecework in Cyprus between the Greeks and the Turks. And he said he was concerned about me using my time to do questionable kind of research, spending my time with Daskalos. I said, why don't you come and meet him? He scratched his head and he said, well, you know, I am a psychology professor. I should be interested in these things. So we go with them. We have a 2-hour conversation. He's very impressed with him. As we were walking outside, Daskalos said to him, Professor, your psychology is at its infantile stage. And Leonard said, yeah, I agree with that. And then at the same time he said, and Professor, you have to stop drinking. He said, why? Because you have an infection on your liver. You must never give blood to anybody. Well, she said, what on earth is he talking about? I just had my physical and I'm perfect. Anyway, we came back to the States. He called me up 3 months later and he said, remember what that healer of yours told me? I said, yes, I remember. Well, he said, I went to my doctor. He took an examination of me and he said that I have an infection on my liver. Hepatitis type B, exactly what Daskalos told him. And the doctors could not believe it because he said at that time there was no instrument that could have identified the coming disease. So the next year Leonard came to Cyprus to ask questions about how did he know. The disease was not life-threatening, but he advised him never give blood to anybody because he will always be a carrier. So these are just a couple of these stories that I have been experiencing time and again. And not only that, but I was impressed with his philosophical understanding and philosophical knowledge. I was talking with Professor Stephen here, and I mentioned to him that if I had to define myself today, what is my real religious belief, I would say I am a version of a kind of a Christianized Neoplatonism. In other words, and that's really the religion of the early fathers of the church and many Christian mystics today. But anyway, I was very impressed with his philosophical acumen. I won't go into that because we're never finished. But basically he was saying that we don't live in just this reality, but we live in several realities. We do not have just one body, but three bodies. We have the body of the physical body, we have the body of our emotions, and we have a noetic body, which is our body of thought. So we really have, we have a psychonoetic, we are a psychonoetic reality. We are capable of thinking because we have a body that is noetical, we have the psychic body, and we have the physical body. And he said that we as human beings is not just this physical body, but also the psychonoetic. So when people die, he said, they don't die. And many people who die, he said, we have to convince them that they are dead, because they think they are still living the kind of life that they just left behind. And we have to help them, he said, move to higher levels. But he spoke with so much conviction and reality. And having experienced his extraordinary abilities and his incredible acumen, those of you who do not mind reading these gray areas from the point of view of mainstream religion, you can find those books on Amazon. But anyway, I was fascinated by this. And then I concluded that authentic spirituality exists outside of mainland churches. So I had overcome my prejudice. I lost my traditional religion during the 60s. I questioned that during the 70s. And during the 80s, I encountered Daskalos, accidentally again, who was demonstrating certain abilities and certain realities that did not make any sense from the point of view of logic. And one time Emily had a problem on her leg when we came back from Cyprus, and I kept telling her to go to a doctor because she couldn't even sit in a car because of the problem. And she thought that it was going away anyway, and suddenly we get a letter from Daskalos, or from one of his assistants, saying, we suggest that Emily goes to a doctor and take care of her right leg, left or right. Anyway, because we noticed that she has a problem, and therefore she should see a doctor. But we'll do whatever we can from here, right? From here, 7,000 miles away. After we got that letter, the pain went away. Now, coincidence, perhaps. But these little things, when they are so cumulative, you reach the conclusion that maybe they are not coincidences. Maybe there is a reality over and beyond the physical. Daskalos told us all kinds of stories about his out-of-the-body travels. Anyway,